Hey, what's up, guys? Michael Anthony here, coming to you live from Bali for another Michael Unbroken podcast. As you can see, I am in the office, or if you're listening, I'm in the office just looking out the window and seeing palm trees. Behind me, just a white wall. Not that special. Bali has offices too, guys. It's true. So anyway, I just finished watching the UFC fight. And for those of you that don't know, and I think it was the first time I've shared this on the podcast, I am a huge fan of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. I have been ever since I was a little kid. I mean, I literally remember walking into the family video on 30th and Georgetown in Indianapolis, walking into the adult section. It had beads hanging from the wall. It's like porn, UFC. And as I was like walking by, I noticed this little light shimmering just so in the corner of the room, and it was UFC number 1. And I rented that video. I went up to the cashier, and I will never forget, at 9 years old, she's like, "Are you 18? And I'm like, "Yes." And she let me rent the tape. They used to be back there with porn back in the day, and now it's all over television with ESPN and all that stuff. But that's another story for another day. I just finished watching this fight, and it was Dustin Poirier, guy from Louisiana, versus Khabib Nurmagomedov, which is a guy from Dagestan, and he's undefeated, 27-0, like probably one of the best fighters of all time. And so they have their fight, and at this point, spoiler alert, Khabib wins. He's undefeated. He is probably one of the best fighters of all time. For sure will be a Hall of Famer. Doesn't really look like anyone is going to be able to beat him for a very long time. And after the fight, they do a post-fight interview. Khabib does his thing, and then they interview Dustin, who just lost. And Dustin tapped out, meaning that he submitted, he was choked out. Like, he didn't die or anything. Like, it's not, if you're listening, you're like, "I'm scared of the UFC." It's not as crazy as you think. I've been rolling jiu-jitsu and practicing martial arts for the majority of my life, and you tap out so you don't pass out or so you don't get injured really badly. And so he did the smart thing as a fighter. And as they're interviewing him, he's crying, and he's talking about how he gave it his all. And even though he gave it his all, he still lost. And unfortunately, that's how it goes sometimes. You can not cut any corners. You can go as hard as you can and do everything possible, and sometimes you're still going to lose. And that's the nature of life. And as he was standing there being interviewed, he was crying. And I couldn't help but myself become overwhelmed with emotion and feel tears welling up in my eyes and slowly dripping down my face, because it was such a beautiful moment to witness this man who is a fighter, who is legitimately probably one of the best guys on planet Earth, a guy who came from nothing. My background and his background, very similar. He didn't graduate 9th grade, right? And he has earned everything in his life from fighting. And he is one of the most kind and generous and giving people probably in sports. And to watch him lose and to watch him standing there being interviewed crying really hit home for me. And crying is something that I've only recently in the last few years learned how to do. I grew up, like most men my age, especially most men my age and older, under the assumption that men don't cry. I cannot tell you how many times the phrase "stop being a pussy" and "stop crying" go hand in hand in the society that I grew up in. And to watch Dustin standing there crying felt so empowering to me as a man watching this, because it's like, I want to be an emotional human being. It is a part of the human dynamic to have emotions and to feel. And I learned how to shut them off. Part of it was because of the child abuse. My stepfather would beat us until the point that tears could no longer come out. He would say constantly, "If you keep crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about." And I literally learned how to stop being an emotional human being. I learned how to stop crying. The byproduct of that was that it impacted me in life, relationships, friendships, everything. Because if you shut down in one area, chances are you're going to continue to shut down. The other part of it was like being amongst boys. And I played sports for the majority of my life. I always look at sports as like, that's going to be my out. That's how I get out of this neighborhood. That's how I get out of this environment and escape from this family, ultimately. That didn't really work. I mean, it did and it didn't. But being on those teams and playing sports with a bunch of boys, there's always this really intense sentiment about you don't cry. You don't get emotional. Win or lose, you never cry. You never show your emotions on the field. You never allow yourself to exist in a fashion that you're a human being. And I think it's detrimental to society. And I think it's leading to a place where a lot of boys turn into men like me, where emotions are secondary to everything else, where I would much rather hurt your feelings and then ever come to the understanding that I was wrong and feel emotions for it. And that's a whole nother story. Again, maybe we're telling a lot of different stories today, but ultimately what I want to think about and I want to give you right now is this thought that I've had that has been sitting with me for quite a long time. When my grandmother died, that was one of 3 times in, of course, of 15 years that I cried. The other is after a really bad breakup. And then one is when I could not get a scholarship to art school in New York City when I was 18. From the span of about 12 years old to 28 years old, 29 years old, I didn't cry except those 3 times. And slowly, as I started doing the work and I started going to therapy and talking these things out and recognizing why I was unable to cry, I started to become, first, extremely uncomfortable. Crying, if you haven't done it in a very long time, is so incredibly uncomfortable. It feels like you are stepping into the unknown. And that's how it was for me for a very long time, especially in the beginning where I would choke back the tears that were starting to come because I felt so uncomfortable with myself. And this could be watching a movie. This could be like after finding out some bad news. I mean, it could be anything. And I would just put it off and stuff it down. And that was a problem. And I remember once I was in therapy and I was having this conversation about crying. And I thought to myself, you know what? I need to allow myself to feel this emotion, whatever it is, happiness, sadness, joy, sorrow, whatever it is, I need to allow myself to feel it. And a lot of that comes with giving yourself permission. You know, I talk about permission and acknowledgement and those things a lot on this podcast and a lot in Think Unbroken because I think that they are the cornerstone of growth, of healing, of health, and of overcoming trauma. And allowing yourself to feel emotion is probably one of the most difficult aspects of that because we become so dissociated from trauma because of the impact on it that it makes us want to shut off. It makes us not want to feel. It makes us not want to express emotion. But it's a detriment to who we are as human beings, as living, breathing entities. And so how do you tap into allowing yourself the space to cry? I'm going to take you on my journey, and maybe you can pull something from this. It started with really watching movies that were really sad. Not joking at all. It just started with watching movies that always made me feel when that scene comes of being uncomfortable, like tears were going to start. And just, even if it was just one tear, I would just let that come. And then I would take my journal and I would write the emotions that I was feeling because of watching that film. And I would write these emotions down and it would be like, I watched Good Will Hunting today and I felt a sense of loneliness that made me feel like crying because I understood what it was like for Will to not know love, to not know companionship, and to feel like he had to figure it all out on his own. And as I wrote these things, as I wrote and watched these films and eventually listened to music, and then even the little thing, like literally I was watching the Super Bowl 3 years ago, something like that, and this commercial comes on, and I literally am like in this room of people crying. Like not like bawling, but just tears falling down my face. And I was like, that was the first time I recognized that I was okay with crying. And it still is something that I'm working on. I feel like for the rest of my life, I will always work on being okay with being an emotional man. And I want more men to be emotional because I think it's so important, because if we can raise emotional boys who are allowed to cry, we are going to have more emotionally stable men in future generations. And I think that it is in our best interest to give little boys the space in sports, in career, in school, in life, in friendships, to cry, to be emotional. And it just starts with acknowledging that it's okay. So I challenge you this week, acknowledge yourself and your emotions and give yourself permission to cry. It's okay. If you are a man listening to this, and I know it's fucking difficult, like it is okay. You can cry. It's totally cool. Even if you have to do it by yourself in your room. So guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Check me out on Instagram at Michael Unbroken and check out Think Unbroken. I'm launching the Think Unbroken Academy very soon. Till next time, my friends, be unbroken. See you.